And so it goes from the River Nile, basically, to the River Euphrates. But here's what they thought in 1948. And it says, in Hebrew, by the gun, it's written in Hebrew, the only solution. In Hebrew, it's rak kach, only thus. Only by the gun will they be able to achieve this expansive territory that they aspire to. And this is all based, the Irgun is based on the hardline ideology of a man named Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky was the head of something called the New Zionist Organization in New York. He died in 1940, and when Jabotinsky died in 1940, it was taken over by Netanyahu's father. And this is the idea of the Greater Israel. This is from an article in a Hebrew Israeli website. It says what Israel's future borders will look like. Basically from the River Nile to the River Euphrates and everything in between. And it's interesting, when the United Nations first created the State of Israel by the partition plan in 1947, they partitioned Palestine between Israeli and Jewish groups, or Jewish and Palestinian groups. And the next day, Menachem Begin denounced it, saying, the partition of Palestine is illegal. It will never be recognized. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. And Eretz Israel will be restored to the people of Israel. All of it and forever. This is the ideology of the current state of Israel, of the Likud coalition. And the Likud party has ruled Israel since 1977. In 1948, this is the first Rothschild agent who became a head of the state of Israel. His name is David Ben Gurion. And 1 week after Israel was established with this conclusion, or the beginning of the war in 1948, he said to his military brass, he said, we, the Israelis, should prepare to go over on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. He said the weak point was Lebanon. He said we can establish a Christian state in the south of that country. And he said we will smash the Arab Legion's strength and bomb Amman, that's Jordan, and eliminate Jordan. And then Syria will fall. If Egypt dares to fight, we will bomb Cairo and Alexandria. This is very aggressive talk coming from a little man in a little country that's just been created. But this is the name of the game. Here is Menachem Begin, and this is the King David Hotel that he oversaw the destruction of in 1946 and killed 93 people. This is very similar to 9/11, actually. And in what they were doing in this case is that this was British military headquarters, the King David Hotel, and the British had collected evidence in a raid, a cross-country raid, and they had gotten evidence that proved that all of the heads of the Zionist movement were involved in terrorism, even the heads of the Jewish agency, which meant that if justice was to be served, these men would be hanged. So in order to prevent the entire Zionist enterprise from going to the gallows, they destroyed the evidence and killed a lot of people. This is Shimon Peres, who has always had the opinion that Israel should frighten the West. This is the former Prime Minister of Israel, Moshe Sharett, 1955. He's speaking about Shimon Peres because they had just discovered and made public another false flag attack on America and Britain called the Lavon Affair, where these Mossad, these Israeli intelligence people, planted bombs in American and British buildings in Cairo, in Egypt. And what Moshe Sharett said, he said, Shimon Peres shares the same ideology as Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And this is exactly what the war on terror is all about. Frightening us, scaring us into supporting a war agenda that benefits the state of Israel. And as you can see, this war agenda is getting more and more serious every day. The terrorism is becoming more frequent. This is going to be, I think, a very bad summer with a lot of terrorism. We've seen, just like in the last couple days, incredible developments. So it's an ongoing thing, and the faster we come up to speed and understand what's going on, the better chance we have of surviving this. Here is Menachem Begin being interviewed by a British journalist, and he was asked in 1974, how does it feel, Mr. Begin, in the light of all that's going on, to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin laughed, and he said, in the Middle East? He said, in all the world. putting upon himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. This is the man who founded the political party that is now controlling Israel. He admits to himself he's the father of terrorism. So when we call the Likud party the party of terrorists, it's not hyperbole. Here he was in 1977 when he became elected to the prime ministership in Israel. And these are the three, this is the troika of terrorists that led the party in the very beginning. It's Menachem Begin in the middle, Yitzhak Shamir to the right, and Ariel Sharon to the left. If you remember 1982, Ariel Sharon was the butcher of Beirut. Here's Mr. Shamir, Yitzhak Shamir, and Shamir was in charge of another terrorist gang called the Stern Gang, or Lehi. And as head of the Stern Gang, he oversaw the murder of the United Nations mediator in Palestine, this man here in the photograph. His name is Folke Bernadotte. He's a royal guy from the Swedish royal family, the Bernadotte family. And he was sent there to the United Nations to try to make some viable solution to the partition plan of 1947 and the war that broke out in 48. And the problem was why Shamir killed him is because this man, the Swedish man, said that we can only solve this problem if we allow the Palestinian refugees to come back to their homes. Well, that makes sense, right? But that was anathema to the Zionists. They said, we cannot let any of these Palestinians come home. We're living in their homes now. So it had to be stopped. So they killed Folke Bernadotte in a Bonnie and Clyde style ambush in Jerusalem. And in that gang that killed Bernadotte was this man's father. This man is Ram Emanuel. His father is Benjamin Emanuel, a doctor in Chicago. This man is now the mayor of Chicago. But Ram Emanuel, as I said, his father was a member of the Stern Gang in Israel when they killed Bernadotte. And it was a small gang. And then in the 1950s, early 50s, he came to America, this Auerbach, his father, his original name was Auerbach, and he had these three kids. And Ram Emanuel became the head Mossad agent in the White House during the time of Bill Clinton, and then he was the first person appointed by Barack Obama. He was chief of staff for Barack Obama, and he was Bill Clinton's special advisor. He was the Mossad man in the White House. He's also the guy who pushed NAFTA through. NAFTA in 1993. If you remember the election of 1992, NAFTA was the big issue. And when he came into the White House, he single-handedly pushed it through Congress. Odd. Is that an Israeli agenda? Getting NAFTA, destroying our manufacturing base? Seems to be. Here is the south of Lebanon that Menachem Begin tried to grab for Israel in 1978. The Israelis only vacated from this area in 2002 due to the resistance of the Hezbollah group. So how did this idea evolve? In 1978, the 9/11 concept was started to be pushed by Israelis. And the guy that pushed it the most was this man Arnon Milchan, or Milchan, some people say. He's a Hollywood producer today, but his very first movie was made in England and France. It's called The Medusa Touch. It starred Richard Burton. And the climactic scene in the movie is the 747 crashing into the Pan Am building. And the same year he made this movie, in 1978, here you see he's very buddy-buddy with Israel's defense minister, Ezer Weizmann. Here they are preparing the props for that scene that they made when they made the movie. This is what I call Israeli ideation. What they're doing with this movie is they're putting out there into the public mind the idea that airplanes can be flying into high-rise buildings. And then in the year 2000, he made another film like this in which it was the World Trade Center was the target. And it was a passenger aircraft flying into the World Trade Center. This was a program, this was the pilot episode of a series called The Lone Gunman, which was a spin-off of The X-Files. And it was made by Rupert Murdoch and his partner, Arnon Milchan. And it was filmed in New York City, actually. They filmed this scene using helicopters flying at the World Trade Center. And then they, of course, used computer-generated imagery to put the plane in there. And it aired on TV, on Fox TV, in March 2001, and was seen by millions of people in the United States. Here he is, Arnon Milchan, the man in the middle, between his two buddies, Shimon Peres on one side and Bibi Netanyahu on the other. And it's reported that Milchan is one of the richest media moguls, or moguls in Hollywood. They say he's the number 2, I think. And they say he's worth $5.2 billion. But he has a long history of being a money launderer. If you read his biography, he's been laundering money for the South Africans and the Israelis for a long time. So the question is, really, whose money is it? Whose money is he using? Well, here's the Netanyahus, father and son. In 1976 to 78, Bibi Netanyahu worked for the Boston Consulting Group, which is a Rothschild-owned company in Boston. And in 1979, he went from the Rothschild firm back to Israel and started the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And they had a conference in July of that year in which they began the big propaganda push, the media push, the political push for the war on terror in 1979. Most of you were kids then, I know. And here in 1980, we have the Isser Harel, the former head of the Mossad. He's the first chief of the Mossad, first chief of Shin Bet. He's a long-term Israeli intelligence expert. And he made a prediction to an American Zionist in 1980 that Arabs would attack the tallest building in New York. Here's what he said. The American, Michael Evans, asked him, "Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?" And he said, "I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism." La la la. And then as to the where, Isser Harel continued, "New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power." How amazing. What amazing prescience that this head of the Mossad knows that 21 years ahead of time, 21 years before, that Arabs would be attacking the World Trade Center. Now, that was his prediction, but oddly, he began putting that prediction into reality. He sent two of his head men, two of his chief men, these two guys, to New York in 1980, and they were given the task of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. And they had a little company, not theirs, it was Shaul Eisenberg's company. It's called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, and it was created especially for this purpose, to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. Now, they actually got it. In 1987, they had the contract, but somebody at the Port Authority discovered that the man that was the president of the company, the man with suspenders, this Shalom Ben-Dor here, that this man was convicted of murder in Israel. As a former head of Shin Bet, he had been involved in arresting some Palestinians for hijacking a bus. And when they got all the passengers off the bus, they had these Palestinian guys there that had been behind the attack. And his men in the field said, "Well, we got these guys, what do we do with them now?" And he said, "Smash their heads with rocks." And so that's what they did, and it led to a legal case in Israel, and he was removed from his position and charged with their murder. And when the Americans discovered that history, they said, "We can't have this guy running security at the World Trade Center. That doesn't go." So they tore up the contract. But had that contract not been torn up, 9/11 would have happened probably in the late 1980s or early 1990s at the latest. But they were stymied, they were stifled, they were prevented. So what did they do? They went to work for these guys. They went to work for Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. If you remember, Maurice Greenberg is the man who owned AIG, the insurance company that we bailed out for $183 billion in 2008. It's criminal. He was once asked by an employee, "How much will it cost for us to go legal and to be legal?" And Maurice Greenberg said, "If we were legal, we wouldn't be in business." And this is really important to understand. The American taxpayers bailed out his company for $183 billion. And when that money was transferred to his company, he just wrote checks to Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and the various companies, the banks that he had insured their profits. We were basically bailing out the biggest investment banks in America in 2008, 2009. Well, these two guys are partners in crime, partners in business. And Jules Kroll, his company, he had a company called Kroll Associates. And Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1993. And when Kroll Associates got the contract for the World Trade Center, these men were already working for him. Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor was working for the man on the top here. And so what they did is when the Israelis were thwarted from getting the security contract, they used like a Trojan horse mechanism and went through an American scion, an American helper, who then got them the contract, got them into the business. This is 1982. This is when the Israelis invaded Lebanon a second time. And here's Ariel Sharon, the man who led the occupation, led the attack, which was a terribly murderous campaign, if you remember 1982. It was the,